Jeffrey M Smith is the best-selling author of Seeds of Deception and Genetic Roulette, a filmmaker and leading spokesperson on the health dangers of genetically modified foods. He's the founder of the Institute for Responsible Technology, and he's traveled to 45 countries over the last 22 years, exposing the devastating impacts of GMOs and Roundup and the ways in which the biotech industry has tried to cover up the evidence.
Hi, everyone. This is Jeffrey Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Responsible Technology, and I'm here with Zach Bush, MD. Zach is a triple board certified, which is rare, physician with an expertise in internal medicine, endocrinology and metabolism, and hospice and palliative care. And he and his team discovered soil-borne compounds that can antidote glyphosate, or so he says, and we're going to find out. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey Smith, for having me back on.
So, Zach, I'm going to be sharing some incredible, well, you're going to be sharing some incredible, I'm going to be asking some incredible questions. Let me say it this way. I have heard you speak. I've interviewed you a couple of times, and you do not take anyone's word for it. You are a pioneer. You're not like the person that says, okay, treat this disease with this drug, and you're like a Sherlock Holmes, and you're looking at stuff and drawing things together. So I'm real excited to be able to talk to you again.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, it's been quite a journey. 10 years ago, I was actually still designing chemotherapy at the University of Virginia. So to now be on the flip side of that world, to realize that nature's got all the secrets is a pretty exciting paradigm.
Fantastic. So 10 years ago, you were the boring scientist MD, and now you're the bore wonder. Okay.
That's right. Something like that.
So we're going to talk about how to antidote glyphosate. Let me just give those new viewers the quick foundation. Genetically modified organisms, GMOs, this is called healing from GMOs, parentheses, and Roundup. GMOs are largely designed to be sprayed with Roundup herbicide. Monsanto makes the Roundup, and they make the seeds, and the vast majority of GMOs are Roundup ready. And the Roundup drives the active ingredient glyphosate into the crop. You can't wash it off. We eat it, and now we're eating tremendous amounts of glyphosate. According to the Journal of the American Medical Association, this month it's an increase of 13-fold total amounts of glyphosate residues in the urine compared to before GMOs were introduced. So if it's in our urine and in our blood and in our tissues, and you have a potential antidote for it, before we talk about the antidote, and by the way, there is a special offer for people. It's down below on the screen, and we'll talk more about it afterwards to encourage you, if you want to try it, to make it easier to try it now. How bad is glyphosate? How bad, and we'll use the term Roundup and glyphosate, just to be clear. Glyphosate is the active ingredient, but there's a lot of other nasty stuff in the Roundup formulation. Yeah. It's over 100 times more toxic. But how bad is Roundup that we would need to create or distribute a product to antidote it?
Yeah, it's a great question, because certainly the industry and the EPA have been trying to reassure us as consumers for almost 4 decades now that this is a very safe compound. And interestingly, the compound was never actually patented as a weed killer at all. It has been patented as an antibiotic, antifungal, antiparasite. It's an amazing list of antis. It kills a lot of single-celled organisms. And the argument they were making that this is safe for humans is that the primary target that they reported was this enzyme pathway that only exists in fungi, bacteria, and plants. It's called the shikimate enzyme pathway. And so because this pathway only existed in single-celled organisms, the chemical companies kept saying, this is safe as water for humans. Literally, that was their line, safe as water.
And safer than table salt, and you can take a bath in it. And by the way, Monsanto is being sued for claiming that it doesn't matter about humans because it's just the shikimate pathway. And why would that be?
Yeah, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it turns out that just because we don't have that enzyme pathway in our bodies doesn't mean we're highly dependent on that enzyme pathway. And so this is probably the most profound, interesting piece of information that we've learned and teased out since I last met with you maybe a year and a half ago. And the shikimate pathway, we've long known, is responsible for some of the important amino acids that build the proteins in our bodies. The amino acid cascade is very similar, remarkably similar to the alphabet. We have 26 letters in the English alphabet, and from that we can build hundreds of thousands of words. And within that, we have 8 vowels. Those vowels in the alphabet, of course, are the most heavily used, and you can't really spell any word without at least one vowel. It turns out that the version of the vowels in your amino acid cascade is the subset we call the essential amino acids.
Mm-hmm.
These 9 amino acids cannot be made by human cells. Therefore, we have to get them from our diet. We have to get them from our environment. And it turns out that 3 of those essential amino acids are made by the shikimate pathway. So amazing. Here we go. You mentioned we genetically modified our food to be sprayed directly with a weed killer. The food's not a weed killer. It's not a weed. The food is being drenched in a weed killer. Why would they do that? Why would we want our food drenched in a weed killer since it's not a weed? And the answer is we're not exactly sure that there was a plan for that, other than they wanted to sell more Roundup, and by not having to spot spray, they could just broadcast this spray all over the fields.
So let me explain what you're talking about. So right now, a farmer that plants Roundup ready soybeans, soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa, the 6 major GMOs, all primarily Roundup ready, they can spray right over the top of the field. Whereas if it's a normal soy, corn, cotton, canola, etc., they have to only spray on the weed or before they plant the seeds, so that they don't kill the plant.
That's right. So they historically sprayed, fence lines. They would spray around the crops, but you couldn't even get it close to the plant, because one of the massive problems with glyphosate and Roundup is it's very water soluble. So even if you didn't spray it on the plant, but the water comes and washes off and into near the plant, it'll still kill it. So very volatile traveling compound. So the advent of the GMO era was really one to allow the farmer to be really broadcasting this thing across huge amounts of space. And the statistics are now ridiculous. We now know that less than 0.001% of the Roundup sprayed on the planet actually hits a weed. And so we cannot call this a weed killer anymore. If it's 0.1% that actually hits a weed, we cannot call it a weed killer. This is actually a crop treatment, is what I would say is how they're now marketing and utilizing this in the industry. So imagine us now deciding we're going to have a crop treatment that blocks 3 of the essential amino acids. Imagine now trying to spell all of the words in your vocabulary, missing 3 vowels. How many words would you misspell?
Well, I could try and take out 3 vowels right now and answer your question, although I have some difficulty.
Exactly. And so it's a profound story that here we have had through all human history a food chain that allowed the human genome, our genes, code for an RNA. RNA then takes amino acids and builds them into large proteins. And so the RNA is really the printing press of our proteins.
All right. So we have the DNA. The DNA gets transcribed into RNA. RNA then gets translated into all these amino acids into a long necklace, and then it gets folded up into a protein.
Spot on. That's exactly right. And so with that, you now imagine the printing press missing a few letters. And so what our concern is that now that we're missing a few letters, we're starting to substitute other vowels or other amino acids for what should have been a shikimate pathway.
So I have a question. This is interesting because, I thought you were going somewhere else. I thought you were going to go into the gut bacteria uses the shikimate pathway to produce these 3 amino acids that form the basis for the serotonin, dopamine, and melatonin. And that, even though our body doesn't have the shikimate pathway, our gut bacteria do. And if we take Roundup, then it could block that and we get screwed up inside. But you're
100% true there. And so it turns out your gut is really the same as the soil. So whether we're talking soil under the corn or soil in your belly, you're going to see the same phenomenon. So if you drink a glass of water now, especially in any agricultural environment, your water's been contaminated highly with it. But even in the suburbs, all the homeowners are spraying Roundup on their weeds down the driveways, and it's washing into your municipal water system. And so regardless of where you're at, you're blocking this shikimate pathway at the soil bacteria, at the plant itself, at your gut, meaning the microbial environment that you just mentioned, and you're leaving the whole system devoid of a few critical building blocks. if you start to supplant the original val or the original amino acid that was coded by your RNA with a different val, you're going to misfold that protein is the concern.
All right, so misfolded proteins are extremely, potentially dangerous. I write about
Potentially dangerous. Yeah, and they actually end up being very common in human physiology now. So we can find misfolded proteins that accumulate. Some misfolded proteins, they just degrade or the body chews them up. But there's at least 26 proteins that we know of in the human body that when they misfold, they can't be cleared, and so they start to accumulate as plaques, these tangled proteins. These plaques are now seen in just about any chronic inflammatory condition. You can find them in pancreas in diabetics. You can find them in the brain of people with any neurodegenerative conditions. You can find these things all over the body. You can find them in different cancer conditions. These tangled plaques are really a symptom of an environment now where protein misfolding is starting to happen broadly across the system.
I write about this in Seeds of Deception. I just want to do a little tangent that the misfolded proteins may be, of course, as you say, resulting from the lack of the available amino acids, the pearls in the necklace, and so the substitutes come in, and when the substitute comes in, it doesn't fold right. But it's also possible that the GMOs create misfolded proteins, because when you put a gene in from a different species and it creates a protein that's never before been inside that crop, there are other proteins called chaperone folders that come and normally work with that have evolved over billions of years to fold it into the proper format. But if you're producing a protein in a soybean that's never been there, it was only before in a bacterium, then you may end up misfolded proteins there. So before we go further, I want to ask you, have we seen an increase? Is there evidence that there's an increase in misfolded proteins in the human body rising since the late 1990s when GMOs and Roundup were full throttle started to be full throttle in our system?
No question. Yeah, and they're manifesting differently. And so in the male brain, that accumulation has been happening in a very specific region preferentially and driving this very linear increase in Parkinson's disease. In the female brain, it's a different spot. And so it's clear that there's probably different inflammatory locations in the male versus the female biome. There's probably different proteins that are being turned on by estrogen versus testosterone that affect everything from the chaperone proteins to the actual gene expression of some of these proteins that can misfold into amyloid. And so we're seeing this gender difference. But in the brain alone, we can show from those early 90s this steady increase in Parkinson's disease in males, and almost matching that same line of growth of the epidemic is Alzheimer's in women.
So let me stop you right there, because, all right, so Parkinson's is men, Alzheimer's in women, because of an increase in misfolded proteins. The misfolded proteins you believe are the result of the substitution of the incorrect amino acid. Is there?
Let me correct that, or let me just expound on that a little bit. That's only one of the causes. You mentioned the chaperones. The other cause of misfolded proteins is actually oxidative damage. And so when an inflammatory process starts to get out of control, and a little bit later we can talk about why is glyphosate causing inflammation in the body, which is a different story. But let's start to suffice just on this protein folding story, that if you have any source of inflammatory oxidative stress, you can misfold a protein simply by oxidizing some of the residues of those amino acids. And so through, I'd say, probably dozens of mechanisms of protein misfolding that are going to stem from nutritional or gut stress.
So we know that Roundup does relate to oxidative stress. In fact, there was some of the documents made public because of a lawsuit from Monsanto showed that they had hired an expert to try and prove that there was no link to cancer. And they hired a Dr. Parry, who was one of the top in the world. And he said, oh, actually, it could link to cancer because there's oxidative stress. And so I was reading the memos. They were all freaking out, saying, well, we could spend a lot of money to re-educate Dr. Parry so he comes around. But it might be, and one question was, has he ever done an industrial study for industry before? In other words, doesn't he realize he's not supposed to have an independent mind in this? So they were supposed to legally turn over any adverse effects to the EPA. They didn't, so that probably was illegal. But they buried the study until these documents made it public. So oxidative stress, that has to do with oxygen. So you don't have to go into it, but we do know that glyphosate causes the oxidative stress. The oxidative stress, you say, can be another reason for misfolded proteins, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And let's go ahead and go into it because it's pretty profound. Because it's really, this is where we start to really depart from the message of the chemical companies. And remember, this isn't just Monsanto now. It went off patent in 2007. Now, all five of the big chemical companies in the United States, and frankly, the vast majority of glyphosate made in the world is made out of China. And so it's now just a chemical company problem. Like all the chemical companies are making glyphosate and dumping it into the agricultural environment through many different avenues. But we need to depart now from saying it's just the shikimate pathway and start to ask the question, is it possible there's other direct targets of glyphosate that actually do directly affect the human system? And that's what our lab has been working on for the last few years, is
Wow.
to realize that, oh my gosh, the gut lining, which is the largest potential exposure you have to the outside world. So your skin has about 1.5 square meters of surface area. In contrast, your gut lining, starting at your sinuses, running all the way through your gut down to the rectum, has a surface area that's roughly the size of 2 tennis courts. So you have this massive, massive membrane. It's so thin compared to the skin. The skin is actually a few millimeters thick. The membrane of your gut that covers those 2 tennis courts is half the thickness of a human hair, 50
Wow.
microns.
One cell, right?
One cell deep, yeah. So you got one cell deep, that is one cell layer that spreads out over those 2 golf courses, or I'm sorry, 2 golf courses, 2 tennis
That would
courts.
be too much for me.
That'd be
Okay.
a little too big of a guide. 2 tennis courts. That 2 tennis court surface area now, picture like a piece of cellophane that is half the thickness of a human hair. That's protecting you from the outside world. Sitting behind that is your gastrointestinal associated lymphatic tissue. That's a fancy long word that we abbreviate as the GALT. This is the lymphatic tissue that composes at least 60 to 70% of your entire immune system in the body. So you have this dense layer of tissue that's got all of your T cells and your activated B cells and all of these immune cells that are fighting the outside world. The reason our body stacks 60 to 70% of our entire immune system right at that ground zero is because it is our biggest potential exposure. And
So,
it's
so, so, in other,
vulnerable.
so in other words, there's a defense. The first defense is physical. There's a cell in the way.
Yes,
Behind that, there's all of these, the alphabet soup of the immune system. And I imagine that it can go out through the cells into the gut, or if something comes through the cells towards the body, then it can also activate there. So you have these lines of defense and kind of a military formation.
exactly right. Yeah. So your first line of defense is structural, like you say. It's like the barricade. Barricade starts to break down. Then you've got, all your, National Guard that can flow, because the immune system can activate over here and send in more resources over there. Or here's a breach in the wall over here, you can send in resources over there. And so that's kind of the structure of that human immune system. Acute inflammation is actually very wonderful stuff. Acute inflammatory response, whether it happens in your bone because you just ran down some stairs and you caused lots of microfractures in the bone, or in the gut lining because you just had a little injury from any chemical or any natural compound, that little injury can lead to an acute inflammatory response where you actually make the wall stronger. You found yourself a little breach that identify itself as a weak area, so you go and you bolster it up, you make more structural proteins, and now you got a stronger area. So acute
So let me translate it into the story. So the wall is breached, and so you send out attack forces to fight the attacker, but then you send a bunch of masons with
yes,
rocks and mortar, and they rebuild. So it actually creates a stronger system.
yeah,
So training over time, for example, when you run down the stairs and you have the microfracture,
yep,
you'll build the
stronger bone.
strength in the system.
So inflammation sounds all good until you tip past your inflammatory coping mechanisms. And so you need enough National Guard to respond, and you need enough of your mortar and all of that to back them up to get the cracks plugged up. Where we start to develop real disorder that can lead to disease is where we start to run out of that reservoir of coping mechanisms. And that's what we're finding with today's nutritional environment.
So in other words, the alphabet soup of the immune system, they become depleted. The mortar and stones, they become depleted.
Unfortunately, part of them never deplete. So the killer T cells and these cells that are pumping out oxidative damage, and so they do that to kill anything. So you got bacteria coming through, you got all kinds of weird chemicals coming through. your T cells just start dumping oxidant. And so they're basically dumping hydrogen peroxide, if you will, or ozone into the space just to sterilize everything, just like dumping it in. That's good in an acute inflammatory response because you should have a bunch of antioxidants that just then flow in, control that oxidative burst, and balance everything out quickly. It's that antioxidant secondary system that starts to get depleted. So now your immune system is just seeing chaos everywhere through this leaking membrane.
But there's no one there to clean it up.
Dumping oxidant, your antioxidant system is getting depleted, and suddenly the immune system becomes its own problem. And that's where we shift from an acute inflammatory response into this phenomenon of chronic inflammation, where the immune system is out of control.
So let's stop right there and bring it back to Roundup and back to glyphosate, because so what we have here is a system designed to defend. We have the shikimate pathway issue, which can create potentially misfolded proteins. We have the oxidative stress, which can create misfolded proteins. In this case, is the oxidative stress that creates the misfolded proteins the same oxidative stress you're talking about that is created from the chronic inflammation, where you end up creating a massive attack or massive inflammation, but no one there to clean it up, no free radical scavenging to clean up the situation?
Unfortunately, it even goes a step deeper. The answer is yes, you're right. That's some of that oxidative stress that's driving potential protein misfolding and, the accumulation of acid, the acidic buildup that then depletes your ability to get nutrient into the body, undermines your ability to hydrate the body, all of these things. And so, yes, that's true. But unfortunately, there's another level that's further damaged, which is inside of your human cells. So not just like the big macro environment, extracellular space being invaded. Now, inside the cell, you have these little microbial-like guys called mitochondria.
Yes.
Mitochondria are responsible for producing the fuel that your human cells run on, ATP. In the production of the ATP fuel, your mitochondria produce a whole family of these oxygen-based compounds that are called redox molecules. As the chemical injury happens from glyphosate or any other numbers of pharmaceutical drugs or other artificial compounds, as they start to hit the mitochondria start to lean towards an oxidative rather than reductant. So it should be a balanced redox, reductant meaning negative charge, oxidant meaning positive charge. As they start to get injured, they start to put out a help signal to the immune system or the greater cellular environment to say, whoa, injury. So it puts out an oxidative burst just like the T cells outside the cell. So you've got an internal response system within your cells plus this external immune system response all starting to shoot oxidant out. That's
right. And then you have the oxidative stress inside, which can cause the misfolded proteins, and you have the oxidative stress outside from the walls, defending the walls. Now, I should say that the mitochondria are also affected by Roundup's ability to grab and hold on to minerals. Roundup, or glyphosate, was originally patented as a descaler to clean industrial boilers and pipes because it's a chelator. It grabs onto all the minerals and doesn't let go. It's a very strong chelator, and it's a widespread chelator, and that provides a lot of the properties of antibiotics and herbicide, etc. Now, the mitochondria need certain minerals in order to function. I think it's manganese, for example.
Huge one, yeah.
Yeah, and so when there is a reduction in the amount of these trace minerals, because we're bringing in high quantities of Roundup, it's still there, it's just bound up inside the glyphosate molecule, then it has been speculated that that's another reason why glyphosate has been shown in at least 3 peer-reviewed studies to damage the mitochondria. And mitochondria, I just gave a talk at a cancer conference. There's a lot of evidence that cancer may be related to the mitochondria, and that if we're damaging the mitochondria, that could explain a lot of the cancers. And glyphosate is now known as a probable human carcinogen, according to the World Health Organization, possibly because of its mitochondrial effects. So coming back to you, I want to understand the Roundup, the glyphosate connection, because you're speaking generically about the oxidative stress being built up inside the cell. Where is it that the glyphosate causes this problem?
It's so interesting. I mean, this all actually ties in on so many levels, and I don't think we need to get into the 52 different levels probably, but where we're talking at this oxidative injury into the gullet, this gastrointestinal lymphatic tissue, what we have shown is that the tight junctions, which are like the Velcro-like protein that hold that huge cellophane layer together. When you're talking microscopic cells, 50 micron cells, the cells that make up your gut membrane are pretty much a cube. They're the same dimension, depth to width, very close to it. And so basically half the width of a human hair in width, half the width of a human hair in depth. So now picture a cell that's half the width of a human hair. How many of those would you have to put side by side to cover 2 tennis courts? And
give me some time, I'll figure it out.
it's trillions. So you got a trillion cells, you got billions of cells lined up on this huge tennis court. And even if there's billions of billions, they all cover the tennis court, they're still useless as a barrier system because they're just a bunch of individual cells kind of bumping into each other, and you could easily push anything through them. So it's not until we form these Velcro-like connections between the cells, these tight junctions, that we actually get a coherent, intelligent macro membrane that protects us from the outside environment. Astoundingly, glyphosate, Roundup, is one of the most potent toxins to this Velcro. And so imagine the situation where we have a chemical that we've put into the food supply, right into our crops, right into our gut, that is a antibiotic, antifungal, so it's killing the microbiome in the soil and in our gut. So we can't make the nutrients we need. We mentioned these amino acids, etc. We can't build the nutrition we need. And now we're losing the microbial life, which actually was the defense thing that precedes our barrier system.
Yeah, actually, that's good to know. It's like first you deploy an army in the gut bacteria,
yes.
Then you have the structure, then you have that immune gauntlet.
Yes.
And so glyphosate is a patented antibiotic. It kills the beneficial gut bacteria really easily, but not the pathogens. And so you can wipe out all the good folks, and now you have all the turncoats where the pathogens grow because they're not being kept in check. And so you have the rowdy mob and horde of the negative gut bacteria before on the outside of the wall.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they actually start to weaken the wall as well. So a lot of those bacteria that we can consider potentially pathologic, you're right, there's no such thing as bad bacteria. Mm-hmm. There's just bad balance. In a balanced ecosystem, every single bacteria, fungi, etc., is important. In an unbalanced system, those kind of remaining bacterial species make lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. And LPS can be a direct toxin to those tight junctions and weaken the wall defenses and cause gut permeability.
So I want to say, last time we were together a year and a half ago, you created a video of the human cells under their normal circumstances. You applied some glyphosate, you sprinkled a little glyphosate, and all of a sudden they separated into individual units.
Yes.
Then you had Restore, which is, there's the name of the product, Restore, which is the soil-based redox molecules that can do something. And in this case, what it did is it bound them back together.
Yes.
And then when the Restore was there before you applied the glyphosate, it never got separated. So now we're understanding one aspect of what glyphosate does is it breaks open the tight junctions between the cells. Now, you've talked about that in kind of isolation. We're sitting over here with information about the walls. We're sitting over here about the mitochondria. How would you say that the breaking up of those tight junctions causes the immune system response, the exhaustion of the free radical scavengers, all of that? How does that work?
Yeah, so as you lose the tight junction, you disrupt the ability for food to be intelligently absorbed across the membrane. So even if you ignore the fact that all of our food has not just glyphosate, we're talking about thousands of weird chemicals, plastics, all kinds of junk in our food and water system now. Regardless of all that toxicity, just think about real food for a second. Kale, for example, one of my favorite superfoods, have most of my patients eating this or ingesting it in some way or shape or form. So I love kale. But the reality is these healthy foods have insoluble fiber in them that should never get across into the immune system. They should stay on the luminal side and pass with your stool. If they stay there, all that fiber has an interesting anti-cancer effect and all kinds of good stuff. However, if you now take a chemical that breaks apart the Velcro system and you've got leak across there, even your health food becomes noxious to the immune system because those big macrofibers and some macroproteins can start crossing that membrane in an uncontrolled, unregulated fashion, and now your immune system is fighting health food.
So it's sort of like, as a modern analogy, just bringing the terrorists into the country so they can wreak havoc.
Yeah, and in fact, your own citizens become a problem at that point. You don't even need a terrorist. Once the breach is there, you can imagine what would happen if you show up a school and 80% of the population there is cops. What's going to be, what's the learning environment for the kids if 80% of the population is police officers with their guns and bayonets and everything else hanging off of them? That's kind of what's happening, is we've got the wrong populations in the wrong places, and so even though we don't need to think of them all as bad guys or good guys or whatever, we're simply just losing the right boundary systems. We're losing the walls. We're losing the system. So we're getting all the wrong guys in all the wrong places.
So this breaking.
It's pertinent for you to take a look at, many of you have gotten allergy testing done. And so you can get big blood panels now or hair analysis. You can do lots of different things to analyze what kinds of foods am I sensitive to. I don't even test this anymore in my clinic because 9 times out of 10, it'll come back with your 5 favorite foods or the top 5 things on your sensitivity panel. Well, that's because you eat those 5 things all the time and you have a leaky gut. You're actually no more allergic to those foods than anything else on the planet. It just happens that that's what you keep introducing to your immune system because you have a leaky gut. And so that's the phenomenon that we're seeing, is glyphosate seems to be creating this ground zero effect through 4 different kind of injuries. Number 1, you're destroying the microbiome. By doing that sterilization and screwing up that, you've got a problem. Number 2, you damage the Velcro. The Velcro then is now leading to this impervious leak. Number 3 is because of the overwhelm at the gullet, you're now doing an oxidative stress pattern. And so you start oxidizing the system. The immune system itself is activating to glyphosate and now to everything else through there. Number 4 is the mitochondria within the cells are getting a direct glyphosate injury where they start ramping up their reactive oxygen species, their oxygen compounds. And you get mitochondrial dysfunction, as you mentioned. You had mentioned one of the mechanisms proposed dysfunction of mitochondria, which is mineral chelation. I have a major concern after 5 years of our team looking through microscopes at cells introduced to Roundup and glyphosate, is that I think we're actually doing most of our damage to mitochondrial potential by screwing up the protein scaffolding within the mitochondria, just like we're screwing up the protein scaffolding of the Velcro on the macro level.
So this is a question I want, is if the system that keeps the gut wall intact is the same system that keeps the cells and the mitochondria intact, I could see how if it breaks open, and it was just a beautiful shot of the whole wall just splitting apart into individual pieces. Is the same structure also used for the organs and the brain and others? Are we seeing the possibility that when we take Roundup or glyphosate in our system, that all of our walls become leaky?
Absolutely. 100% true, because the ZO1 protein, the protein that makes up the majority of that tight junction Velcro, we measure that now in kidney tubules, in vascular tissue, in the blood-brain barrier, all over the place. And so it turns out that every membrane in your body, think of the liver membranes that are supposed to protect your heart from all the mess in the gut, your blood vessels that are supposed to traffic nutrients all over the body, all of those are tied together with tight junctions. So your blood vessels get leaky, the kidney and liver membranes get leaky, your blood-brain barrier gets leaky, the whole system is leaking across the system. Any macro membrane that is touched by Roundup is going to be expected to have a weakening of their protein structure. This is one of the scariest discussions I've had about Roundup, because like, I don't want to be a sponge. I don't want to have the toxins flow into areas that my body's working overtime to detoxify, but without the walls in tight junctions, then your blood-brain barrier is pierced, your liver, your kidneys, etc. So I want to ask you a question before we go on. I recently published an article in a peer-reviewed journal, the International Journal of Human Nutrition and Functional Medicine, and it was about how 3,256 people reported improvements in 28 different conditions when they switched to non-GMO and largely organic food. So I want to name, let's say, the top 10, and I want you to tell me if this conceptual framework
the gut bacteria problem, the tight junction problem, the gulp blowing up with all sorts of, sending out all of the army, and the mitochondrial problem, if they could explain these particular disorders, and even if you want to, if you could say, oh yeah, that one in particular of the four would explain that particular disorder.
Sure.
So the number one reported benefit from 85% of the respondents, so it was an incredible large number, was digestive problems improving. So which of the areas would you say are affected by the digestive problems? Is it all four?
All four,
Okay.
no question. And that's really frontline injury. I think that, all four of those environments are really the definition of gut health. And if you look at any, you go to American Gastroenterology, any of the big Western medicine, allopathic locations, I get so frustrated at this stage of the conversation because here we are, we're supposed to be super educated, super brilliant people. But if you go to the American Cancer Institute or you go to American Gastroenterology, you can't even find an intelligent definition of what gut health is or what cancer is. They're wrong. The definitions they have there, we've known for 20 years are wrong at the basic science level. And this is no conspiracy theory. Literally, the people who are doing the work in the labs know that these definitions are way missing the point. And so you can't find a definition of gut health that makes any sense in any of the allopathic environments. But in reality, that is what makes an intelligent or functional gut. Gut intelligence comes from strong ecosystem, strong barrier system, an immune system with very robust antioxidant reservoir, and mitochondrial population within those gut cells, vascular cells, etc., that are ready to respond with either a reductant or an oxidant. All four of those massively important pieces to gut health are completely undermined by glyphosate.
So it seems to me that it would make sense that the one that was most popular is the one that's affected by all four, and it's the first point of contact with our system.
Yes.
It has an entire 2 tennis courts to do its.
I would say that's the main thing. Is it's probably the largest surface area, the largest potential activation of the immune system.
And we're talking inflammatory bowel, irritable bowel, acid reflux, bloating, constipation, diarrhea. All right, the next 60%, fatigue.
Yeah. So fatigue is all four again, but the major piece for fatigue is going to be really two of these pieces. Number one is going to be the tight junction disruption. We've been talking about this cellophane layer as if every single one of those cells was the same cell, and that's absolutely not the case. It turns out about 30% of those cells that make up that huge macromembrane of covering the tennis courts are actually serotonin-producing endocrine cells. They're not just brush border absorptive cells. They're actually endocrine hormone-producing cells that we now recognize to produce over 90% of the serotonin in your body.
Right.
Serotonin is a neurotransmitter. We've always, as physicians and scientists, thought that was all in the brain. We thought the neurons were producing all their serotonin. No, not at all. 90% is produced in your gut lining. So now picture a situation where you decimate the workforce that produces 90% of your neurotransmitter. Now what's going to happen to your brain function? You're going to be really prone to major depression, anxiety disorder. You're going to be really prone to sluggish brain transmissions through the most complicated neurologic processes, which begin with sleep. So poor sleep quality is really the number one complaint that's really underlying all of this fatigue that we have in this country. We have poor sleep quality because we have a lack of neurotransmitter production because the factory has been blown apart at its foundation.
And is it, in terms of the damage to the serotonin producing cells, is that simply the Velcro situation, or is it the lack of the tryptophan that's produced by the shikimate pathway, or is it something else, some aspect of glyphosate we haven't talked about? Why is it that to me, you've just jumped ahead and mentioned many of the problems that people are reporting as getting better from when they switch to a non-GMO organic diet. And I know that the gut bacteria work with these cells to produce the serotonin. And
yes, very good point. Yeah, so 90% of your serotonin is made by these endocrine cells, but it's been demonstrated by multiple labs that if you don't have the right bacteria on the surface of those cells, your endocrine cells never produce serotonin either. So you need the microbiome, you need the intact endocrine cell, and then you need an intact glial cell on the back of that to absorb the serotonin information, transmit that up into the central nervous system of the brain and everything else. So again, I think you're going to say all four, that was five, all four things are responsible. But I would say if you were going to pick any one of those, and we haven't done this, we haven't proved this out to say, well, this one is more important than this one. But I would say if anything was going to be most decimated, it's going to be that structural issue. When you structurally disrupt that membrane, the chance of you being able to make serotonin is low. Whereas with the microbial life, we know that glyphosate doesn't actually sterilize the gut, else we'd all be sterile by now. It just screws up the ecosystem somewhat. So I think there's still probably, even in a screwed up gut, going to be enough bacterial around so you don't completely screw up the serotonin signaling. The disruptive thing would be number one. Number two may actually be the mitochondrial issue, is that we know that mitochondria are far more dense in a neural cell than a non-neural cell. In a neuron, you may have 2,000 or 3,000 mitochondria versus just 200 in an endothelial cell or some other cell of the body.
So in a neural, the neurons are the ones that runs the brain, and the brain uses, massive amounts of energy. It's 5% of the body weight, but it uses 25% of the body's energy when it's at rest. That could explain the fourth. I'm going to jump over the third for a minute. The fourth most common ailment that improves was brain fog, about 52%. Now, let me see if I have it right. The mitochondria creates the energy. Mitochondria can be damaged because of the cell walls of the mitochondria, and possibly also the lack of the trace minerals that the mitochondria needs to turn on.
Yep.
And then you also have the serotonin. With serotonin production, well, that influences melatonin, and melatonin helps us go to sleep. And if we can't go to sleep, we can have brain fog. So am I missing anything in the brain fog?
Yeah, no, I mean, all of them are involved. The amino acids, we can even back up to the shikimate pathway. One of those there's three essential amino acids there: tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. All three of those are very critical for neurotransmitter function and the structural function of even a neuron on a lot of levels. So, we strip away the building blocks for the neurons. We stress the hell out of their mitochondria. We overwhelm them with oxidative stress. We decrease their neurotransmitter production from the gut. It's just.
This is like,
it's really an all guns are firing.
This should be studied at West Point, like how to destroy a system from all these different angles.
We don't need to get into a conspiracy, but it's quite possible that this stuff did come out of military research. We know that chemical warfare has actually exploited some of these very specific targets we're talking about. And in fact, Monsanto made Agent Orange as one of the major chemical production systems until the end of the Vietnam War, and then they turned their attention to Roundup. But Roundup is another organophosphate, just like Agent Orange. So even though your quip was kind of a quip, it's actually pretty stunning that what used to be military technology, when we ran out of enough growth for those companies, we went ahead and turned our military technologies towards our own food chain.
Yes, I talk about that, but I won't go in. I have to get back to this list. But what I'm going to do is, instead of giving you each one to comment and say which is I think we've demonstrated enough on-the-fly questions and answers to show how they all work together, and some may be more than others. I'm just going to read a dozen or so, and then afterwards tell me, is there anything in there that could not be explained by one of these five mechanisms or four mechanisms? So we said digestive and fatigue, overweight or obesity. I'm really interested in that. Brain fog, anxiety and depression. You already talked about that in terms of the serotonin. Food allergies and sensitivities. You talked about that in terms of the leaky gut getting the foods getting into the system and causing these antibody responses. Memory and concentration. I like to say that twice just to emphasize. Joint pain, that's very interesting to me. Seasonal allergies, gluten sensitivities, insomnia, other skin conditions, hormonal problems, musculoskeletal pain, autoimmune disease, and eczema, and then cardiovascular disease. All of these are 20% or higher of the people who responded said that these are the problems that get better when they switch to a non-GMO and organic diet. Is there anything in there that could not be explained clearly by these mechanisms that you're associating with glyphosate?
Nothing to eliminate, only to add. You can't pick up a peer-reviewed journal in any sort of subspecialty anymore without reading the importance and clear scientific connection to the gut. It's either to the microbiome or to this tight junction system, the leak, the oxidative stress. You know, we are coming to terms as scientists and physicians that literally everything is going to tie back to the gut sooner or later, because it's the vast majority of the system. You know, if you make 90% of your neurotransmitter serotonin in the gut, there's not a single neurologic condition that we could possibly say is disordered that's not going to somehow be tied back to that serotonin production system. There isn't a single inflammatory condition of any kind. And remember, chronic inflammation is the underpinnings of every disorder we know to exist in that chronic disease cascade. You know, you're starting to knock on the door that really transformed me about almost 11 years ago. You know, I was designing chemotherapy. I was treating diabetes and autoimmune disease and bone disease and all this in my clinics at the University of Virginia. I was handed a book by one of my patients that said, you know, you can reverse diabetes in 3 days. It's a book by Dr. Neil Barnard. And I said, oh, that sounds like complete bunk. I trained under the #3 endocrine program in the whole world. Nobody ever said you could reverse diabetes. Picked this thing up and kind of glanced through it. And I was like, wait a second, there's real science in this book. And so read it in 2 nights. It changed everything. And as that started to progress from me realizing I didn't know anything about nutrition, I need to relearn that, everything else, you start to realize there is really no such thing as disease at all. You just rattle off a bunch of words that we like to refer to as diseases, or we've labeled as diseases. There is literally no such thing as cancer, diabetes, osteoarthritis, all these different things. There's only such a thing as lack of health in these tissues. When you start to lose the underpinnings of health in the tissue, you're going to manifest oxidative stress, chronic inflammation, misfolded proteins, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, of course the whole system crashes. Well, that's about as interesting as saying, if we go to your neighbor's house and steal his windows, rip half his doors out, tear off half his shingles, undermine his foundation, then his house is going to start to suck. That's how stupid it is that we have a whole medical system trying to label all these things and trying to define pathophysiology of disease. It's boring as heck in the end, because it's going to be the same pathways over and over and over again. So, if there's any nuance to how it manifests in a population, it's going to have to do with just the general environment. Oh, you happen to be male, so you're more likely to get Parkinson's. You happen to be female, you're more likely to be Alzheimer's. But in fact, it's just the same pathways being activated in all of these people. So, you know, before the FDA and FTC can say, hey, these guys are talking about disease, we're not talking about disease. We're actually talking about the underpinnings of the loss of health. And it all is going to turn back to a disconnect from our ecosystem, which is just another obvious statement. If you stop living in the nature that you were designed for, you're probably going to suffer. And we see this with animals. You take an animal out of the incredible African savanna and you stick them in a zoo in Chicago, they're going to have problems. They're going to get hoof diseases. They're going to have infections. You're going to have all this veterinary bill building because you simply pulled that zebra out of the savannah. And that's exactly what we're doing with our lifestyles. We outsourced our food production. That was not an intelligent decision in the end.
Well, I want to ask you something. I mean, you paint I love the analogy of the house. I mean, everyone immediately starts thinking of the leaking and the wind coming in and the rain coming in. And then they think, oh my God, we have 2 tennis courts with these little cells. And if they're open, we have the same kind of thing happening inside of us. So I want to talk about the solution. Okay, the solution to we said in the beginning, you have what you say is an antidote to glyphosate. And, you know, a lot of times I'll be traveling around the country or the world and people will come up to me and say, you saved my life, or you saved my kid's life, because they stopped taking GMOs, they switched to organic, and dramatic changes occurred. This woman said something to me and she says, you saved my life. And then I was smiling and said, thank you. And she said, you and Restore. It's like, okay, tell me about it. She was in the hospital for 7 weeks, and I can't go into more details or the FTC will be knocking on the door. But she said she noticed something right away. Tell me about why you think that this compound found in 50 million year old, I know I'm plot spoiling, I'm giving you away some of your.
No, that's good.
50 million year old soil. Why is it that this stuff can act as an antidote, and does it act as an antidote to the microbiome piece, to the wall, to the galt, to the mitochondria, etc.? Tell me about it.
Yeah, so it was a fascinating journey. So I was actually running my nutrition clinic. I left academia in 2010 and started a nutrition center in rural Virginia, and decided to start this in the poorest county in Virginia, really, because I wanted to reach out and figure out a nutrition program that would help all of America reverse our chronic disease
Thank
epidemic
you.
through food. Was not interested in going and start a vegan clinic in Santa Barbara or something like that. I mean, I love you all in Santa Barbara, but the reality is if we don't fix the heartland of America that lives in food deserts, we're still going to collapse financially, physically, everything else. So we set out in 2010 to figure out what kind of nutrition program would be scalable in the most impoverished areas of the country where we have food deserts, where there's not a grocery store for 150 miles or whatever it is. And so in that environment, we were starting to find out that, man, despite our incredible program we'd put together, we were feeding incredible amounts of health food, we were juicing, doing all this stuff. There's a good third of our patients that were getting sicker, not better, on health food. And that's what led us to unfold this whole story that you and I have been sharing now. But in that process, we started to ask questions about the soil, and rather than just the plants we were eating. Like, is there something wrong with the kale that's now making these people sicker, not better? Or is the kale lacking something that should be making them better? And in that journey, we started studying soil science and popped to page 40 of this white paper on soil science. And there's this huge carbon-backed molecule with all these oxygen, hydrogen binding sites on one end that, not necessarily two-dimensionally, it didn't have much recognition, but if you suddenly imagined it in 3 dimensions, that oxygen side looked a lot like the 3-dimensional structure of some of the chemotherapy compounds I've been making. And so the aha moment was, oh my gosh, there could be something down in the dirt. Forget the plant as a medicinal. The dirt might be medicinal. If we could figure out where those carbon molecules are coming from and how to get them stable, we might have some magic. And so that started us down this angle. Within a couple of weeks, we had figured out that these were actually millions of different variants of this carbon molecule that were in soil, and that they were being made by bacteria and fungi. This was the exciting moment. This was when we suddenly, goosebumps all over. Oh my gosh, I think we just figured out that we know absolutely nothing about human physiology. And so the
usually aha experiences work opposite. Usually,
yeah, you would hope.
Eureka! And you're like, I got it. I don't know anything.
Yeah, this was one of those, holy crap, I don't know a damn thing moments. And so what the realization was that all those years of cancer research that I had been in, and endocrine practice and endocrine research and blah, 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 everything that we've ever learned in Western medicine down to this biochemistry level of understanding health and disease has been done in sterile petri dishes, which means we have no idea the regulation of the microbiome in soil, plants, gut, anywhere on those human systems. So we suddenly got super excited. I mean, I was beside myself. I didn't sleep for 3 days and everything else because I was just like, this could change everything we understand. And my excitement was that mitochondria that we had mentioned earlier produced this redox signaling that by the time I'd been doing my cancer research, we had found out, oh my gosh, these are really important for regulating human health and human cell repair and all these different things. And then we were turning our mind to the microbiome and nutrition, all this stuff. It had never crossed my mind that because single-celled organisms like bacteria and fungi don't have mitochondria, they wouldn't be able to do redox signaling. And so in this moment, we suddenly realized, oh my gosh, they do talk. Your bacteria and fungi are talking. They have to make their own communication network because they don't have mitochondria. And so this is a mind-blowing moment where you're suddenly thinking, we have been studying human health as if we live in these isolated, sterile bubbles. And we think that cellular communication and cell-cell processes are happening through human effort. But we already knew at this moment that 90% of the cells in your body are actually bacteria, not human. 90%, 9 to 1, you've got bacteria to human cells. And so this was an extraordinary moment. We might be lacking 90% of the communication network. What are the human cells going to do in their ability to repair when we put that into play? This was the moment that our basic science started to catch up with our clinical belief, the clinical belief being that there is no disease. There's just a lack of health. This was the moment as there is no disease, there's just a lack of communication. And that moment changed everything under the microscope for us as well as our clinical practice. We knew we needed to go after a lot of these. And so once we'd figured out that bacteria and fungi were making these carbon snowflakes, if you will, each one slightly different from each species, we started to see these as a full vocabulary. So bacteria makes one of these carbon molecules. It's one word in a huge language. the more diverse the bacteria and fungi, the more vocabulary you have for health and healing. So that was kind of the thought process.
So Zach, I want to stop you. This is fascinating, and I'm getting the goosebumps. But you say that when the bacteria do not have a way of communicating with each other because they don't have the mitochondria,
Yeah.
but they create these compounds that allow the communication to take place. So there's something in these structures that can then transmit information between one cell and another, between one organism and another?
You just said that very well. It transmits information. It's not the source of information, which is very, very important. Because if that were the case, if I was giving you a supplement that was a bunch of instructions on what to do with your body, it could be dangerous. This is not anything. This is actually just the wireless communication network. So imagine your cell phone for a second. Your cell phone has a computer in there that receives and transmits signals all the time. But if you're more than 7 miles from the nearest repeater or cell phone tower, it suddenly becomes useless as a communication tool. Now you can turn it on and you can use its calculator or click on a few apps that might be able to run locally, but you can't function to the outside world with that cell phone. But nothing broke in the cell phone. And so that cell is working fine, and then you get close to the cell phone tower, and now you can know exactly what your neighbor wants to tell you, and it's now transmitting the information to you. Same thing with Restore. What we found is that if you get these carbon molecules all lined up and tracing into the system, they function as that wireless network through the extracellular matrix. So now one cell can send a signal across to another cell, say, I need more protein over here. I'm getting weak on the front lines. I need more tight junctions. Well, the nucleus inside those cells just starts cranking out ZO1, makes new protein, sends it in. You've got mortar and all that building into the cracks. And so it was this extraordinary moment where we realized how exciting. None of the cell phones are broken. Humans look like they're collapsing all over. There's cancer, there's heart disease, there's all these fake diseases we've made up. And in reality, none of the cell phones are broken. We're simply lacking that wireless network.
We have the analogy of the Defense Department in our bodies, the microbiome, the physical wall, the GALT. And we talked about West Point. I think one of the strategies, I've never studied it, is to eliminate the ability of an opposing army to talk to itself. When you can kick out the command and control so that they can become uncoordinated, then you are in a situation where they're very vulnerable. So what you're saying is that we are, because we're not eating, and this is the question I'm wondering, for some reason we don't have those compounds that our ancestors had because of the soil differences between how we're growing now and how we're used to grow. And so the communication system is breaking down. And so the body's ability to know where it needs to deploy its resources is compromised. And so then there's deterioration simply because of lack of intelligence functioning as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. And you can imagine, what happens just with isolation. If you strip away the communication network from, a platoon commander who's got his 26 guys out in the field, and he suddenly gets isolated and he can't call in air support for his situation and everything else, and he's under attack from whatever's leaking in, he can't mount the defense response, so he's isolated. Now take it down to a single human being. Mm-hmm. And this is where it just gets super interesting to me, because I'm a cancer researcher historically and all this. And a cancer cell is ultimately nothing more. There's only one reality to a cancer cell, is it's lonely. It's profoundly isolated. You have to have one cell that's isolated and alone for a long period of time before it will turn into a cancer cell. And so ultimately, is glyphosate a carcinogen? It's a probable carcinogen by WHO and all this stuff. The reason why there's all this discussion is they keep looking at the direct injury inside the cell at the nuclear DNA level of the cell to say, well, there's a little bit of DNA damage, but not nearly as bad as the sun. But it must not be a carcinogen. Because if you go and read American Cancer Society, the definition of cancer is still a genetic disease. It's a damage to the DNA, and therefore you get a cancer cell. That's not right.
Let me guess. You're going to talk about the relationship between cells as the key.
That's it. If you lose that connection to your neighbor and you get isolated, what does your behavior start to look like? It gets desperate. And this is really amazing because it's happening at the human cell level. If you get that desperate cell that now thinks it's the only thing, it wants to live, and it doesn't know that life is a 70 trillion celled organism anymore. It just thinks that it is life. It can't see or hear any other life around it. And it says, oh no, I got to preserve life. I got to start to proliferate because I can't fix myself. I'm injured. I can't repair. So the only option then is to proliferate faster because you're dying pretty quickly, and that becomes a tumor.
All right. So coming back to restore, and I love this new way of looking at it. With restore, you have two things. You have, and tell me if it's two things or one thing. You're creating these compounds that have somehow been stabilized in your system that can cause intercellular communication that allows the whole system to function to restore the health. It's a nice name, restore. And then the second thing is it binds cells that have been broken apart by the influence of glyphosate, and I saw also by gluten. So are those two different things and the two modes of action of restore, or is the binding of the cell walls part of that communication piece?
It's a response to just the communication. So I think restore is probably the most passive compound you'll ever take. It's actually more passive than water, and it's actually safer than water. We've shown that, if you take pure water and put it on, your renal tubule cells, which are the canary in the coal mine, they're kind of the most sensitive cell in the body. This is what we do all of our safety trials on. If you go and do that mechanism with water, you'll start to see toxicity around 20% concentrations of water. In contrast, this solution, you can put into play in that 50% and 100% concentrations. You can grow renal tubule cells and they thrive. And further than that, they actually start to communicate. We've never seen proximal tubule cells in culture connect. They're always isolated. They always bounce around. We have seen gut cells in culture be able to make a membrane and all that. Nobody's ever seen renal tubule cells bind together and make an intelligent membrane until restore. And this is what I mean by, holy cow, we don't understand human physiology until you put the communication network of the bacteria and fungi on. And within minutes, renal tubules that in the history of mankind have never made protein synthesis extracellular matrix in a petri dish are suddenly doing it like it's obvious. There's no confusion as what needs to be done. Put the wireless network in, and then immediately all the cells say, oh my gosh, fantastic, I'm not alone. Look, there's thousands of other renal tubule cells. We could all get together and we can make a renal tubule. And so it's just this incredible story of communication. And I want to draw the macro version because I think it's so hopeful for our society right now. Why does some 66-year-old guy climb up in a tower and shoot 200 random strangers in a concert? He's a tumor cell. He's totally isolated. He started to think that he was the only logical piece of life left and that everything else was just a threat to him. Was that his exact mindset? I don't know, but it was something similar to that. So had lost any sense of connectivity to the larger organism of humanity that it seemed totally rational to go and shoot any competitive cells around that might be competing for whatever. And so I think we're seeing the macro behavior, not just at some crazy guy in a tower. Our presidents are from every walk of political bent. It doesn't matter. They're all getting inflammatory, aren't they? Their rhetoric is inflammatory. They're getting isolationist in their political views. Everybody says build walls, so we keep out the invaders. And it's so fascinating, but I think we're literally seeing human behavior on the macro level mimicking what's been happening for the last 15 years in our guts.
First of all, my renal tubulars are saying, how do I get this product? What do I need? How much do I take and all that. I just want I've got the chorus of my various cells are like, I want to find out more about this product. I just want to ask one thing before I get to that. I made a statement, but I wanted you to respond to it, and I kind of embedded it in something else. Do you think that the lack of these cell towers turning on, the lack of these macromolecules, is because of the way that we have destroyed the soil in our monocultures, in our Roundup spraying, et cetera? Do you think that these normally were part of the human diet in the past, and now because of our current industrial agriculture, we are actually denuded of this, and that's what we're suffering? That's in addition to Roundup, that's another reason why that's the case?
Exactly right. And then now think of a human being experiencing this. So you're a human being, your immune system starts to go down and be under threat from this constant leak. And so what's going to happen? You're going to start to get infection. You get colds more, you're more prone to infection, just respiratory stuff, just your immune system's not functioning. It's overwhelmed. And so you start to suffer all over the body. Well, now you've got an ear infection, or you got chronic pharyngitis or strep, or you got, chronic bronchitis. You go to your doc and what do? They prescribe an antibiotic. Our Western medical society is absolutely fueling the fire of the destruction of this communication by trying to treat symptomatically this imbalance in the microbiome due to this destructive thing. And we just add a nuclear bomb to that already mess. Physicians are now prescribing about 7.7 million pounds of antibiotic a year, and that's been pretty stable over the last 10 years. 7.7 million pounds equates to 833 prescriptions per 1,000 men, women, and children in the United States of America. 833 per 1,000. And so some 83% by just the numbers are getting exposed to an antibiotic in a single year. That is a decimation that's on top of this whole farming industry. So now we have this alignment of destruction of the ecosystem between our farming and our pharma, and we get the farming pharma mix, and now you've got no hope at your front line of defense functioning. So you lost the microbial defense system. That means your whole network of communication that I just described to these carbon molecules just collapsed. So you're getting isolation of cells that are now being directly damaged by the tight junction injury of glyphosate, which is further isolating them. And since there's no cell-cell communication network, they don't even know they're supposed to make more protein to bind that up. So now the immune system gets completely overwhelmed by oxidative stress and is directly injured by the glyphosate. And so it's just like cascade on cascade after cascade of overwhelm. That's how we've gone exponential with this lack of health. And so I do want to emphasize that there is hope. It sounds grim, but I also don't want you to walk away thinking our only hope is a product. It's just not like that. I think if anything, I'm more excited. The products we make or the science we have, it's 10,000-fold the science we have. The science we have, and through the help of you, Jeffrey Smith, and through so many others this year, Patrick Tempo at the GMO Revealed, it just goes on and on and on. There are voice boxes out there now that are megaphoning this message out that the science is proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that GMO crops are allowing the widespread use of toxins into our food and into our children that's demolishing the foundations of human health. That needs to be the reality. And the antidote, if you will, is not just, there's no product that's the antidote. Wireless communication network of Restore has been an exciting new paradigm of understanding how the microbiome, the bacteria, the fungi, all this stuff, shore up our foundation. And in fact, really become that communication of help and communication of mobilization through every level of the body. Absolutely exciting. But you can't really get to optimal health until you do what we started with, perhaps, which is say, we got to where we are today because we unplugged from nature. You're not going to actually get to optimal health if you go and take a product and you stay living in a cardboard or what we call drywall box that then you walk out into your garage and get in an air-conditioned car and cruise to your air-conditioned office and get in there and use in blown air that has fungi and weird microbiome, then get in your air-conditioned car and it's off-gassing plastic, and you drive to the grocery store and you buy a bunch of contaminated food and you drive back home to your drywall box. Like, that's the life of 95% of America. No wonder we aren't healthy. And so if you're excited about Restore, just let that be the first step towards reconnecting to nature. It's a massive step. What an exciting step. It's a bizarre step. We've literally extracted this from 50-million-year-old soil, like you mentioned, which is a fossil layer of soil. 50-million-year-old soil. The reason then is we've never since then had such a healthy layer of soil. Our soil levels have been diminishing ever since. So imagine humans showing up kind of on the scene a few million years back, or maybe you think 5,000 years back, depending on your worldview. But regardless if it's 5,000 or 50 million, humans, your body for sure, but humans in general have never seen this level of communication happen. So this is the goosebump moment of Restore. Can we actually take the human being to a level of cellular function that's never existed in human history? Does it start to look like, if you look back through human history, have we always been fighting unnecessary wars? Have we always been unnecessarily paranoid of others? Have we always been doing us and them? Have we always been at the macro level functioning as if we were lacking some sort of unified, uniform communication network? Is it possible that by diving into the soil, we can actually get closer to a higher enlightenment of the human being? And actually, as weird as that sounds, as far out, we are starting to see some pretty clear signs that this is exactly what's happening. I think that my life is a good example of it. I was a depressed, crashing doctor. I was overwhelmed, stressed out. My insurance companies wouldn't pay me. It was just, I was in a mess. I was lonely as hell. I was a cancer cell on the human level. And then I had this moment where nature reached in and said, Doc, it's cooler than you could ever dream. You want to be a part of the game. And I had this moment where I could choose to stay in my box and just say, no, 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 I can only make money by prescribing drugs. Or am I willing to say, everything I know is wrong, or everything I know is at least profoundly incomplete? And can we go bigger? And ever since then, I was the first human to start drinking this stuff right out of my labs. And I was doing it IV. I mean, I was out of control for a while. I was buried in communication from bacteria. What's quickly started happening is I started to get more clarity of why am I here? I think that's the most desperate question that any human asks is, why am I here? What's the point of all this toil? I get up in the morning, I slog through a day, I get overwhelmed, I frustrate my wife, I don't know what it is, and my kids are, we're just lacking that cell-cell connection that says, here I am here to do this, that next thing. And I didn't figure this out until at least 3 years into using Restore in thousands of patients. It starts about maybe, I mean, now that I know it, I can start to see the signs of it within a few days of people taking this, where the lights start to go on, not from their brain fog. It's not just brain fog listening, it's self-identity starting to emerge. And I'm getting pretty good at recognizing it in my patients. I get a glimmer in their eye. I'm like, oh, there it is. It's starting. But you really see it happen some 16, 18 months in, 20 months into these barrier systems being up. First, second, third, fourth lines of defense are up. You have decreasing inflammation through the whole system. But more importantly, cell-cell signaling is now booming through the whole system. And they come back and say, Doc, you know what I did last week? Big grin on her face. I finally left my husband. He's been beating me for 30 years, and I haven't had the guts to leave. And then just a couple weeks ago, I realized I love myself too much to stay in this. I'm leaving. That's a human being that got enough self-identity that they were so amazed by self that they started to develop self-love, and they drew some healthy boundaries in their macro world, just like they had about 18 months ago, drawn healthy boundaries between the outside world and their gut lining.
Interesting.
It's so exciting.
I want you, first of all, I honor you and your thinking that does not take dictation from anyone. This is what I started out by. I recognize people talk about you, they hear you speak at a conference, and you kind of hijack the conference. Everyone just talks about what you talked about for the rest of the conference because you're shaking up the system, and you're doing it based on your own experience and your experience of your patients. So we're going to wrap up right now, and I know that there's some practical things which I feel kind of guilty about raising after that inspiring experience that you gave us all. But so if I wanted to do the 16, 18, 20 months of it, or whatever, even if I wanted to just try it, how much do you take? How often do you take it? Can you take too much? Is there some people that are too sensitive that they need to start with a lower amount? Give us the practicality. And I know you're not allowed to talk about what you would expect in certain disease types because the Federal Trade Commission does not allow that kind of discussion around a supplement. So don't tell me anything around that. Just tell me.
I can do that. So, along the FTC, FDA lines, it's a really fun thing. So, the FDA has this catch line that I'm sure everybody in the audience has heard. You can't, this supplement or thing or technology doesn't diagnose, treat, or change the course of any disease. And the awesome thing about Restore is it doesn't do anything. It's just the wireless network. And so this is literally the first supplement that's probably 100% compliant to the FTC and FDA because all the science is saying this isn't trying to do anything to you.
There's no active ingredient. There's no active ingredient. It's the whole body that's the active ingredient.
The body is literally the active ingredient, because like you said, it's not giving any information. It's just transporting the information from one cell to the next, or from one
But
to the
I'm
next.
bringing you back down. The
I'm right there
practical.
with you. And
Okay.
so so the cool thing is it's just doing what your body needs to do. And so in a large, exciting situation is you can actually figure out what your usage is. Now, we've come up with a teaspoon 3 times a day as kind of that 80-90% of the consumers. That's a great first place to start. 1 teaspoon or 5 milliliters of liquid. It's a liquid supplement. You put that into you can put in your water, you put in your food, but most people just spray it in their mouth, or they take a spoon or whatever it is right before a meal. They can take it 30 minutes before a meal or with the meal. It doesn't really matter. If you forget, you ate and you're like, oh, shoot, I just ate, and oh, I'll just take it now. You just take it afterwards. It doesn't really matter when. But you take this 2 or 3 times a day. Teaspoon is a good starting point. And then just listen to your body. You can now hear yourself. You've got a communication network going. And if you're excited and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling 50 years younger. I've never felt this good in my gut or anywhere else. I'm thriving. Well, then just stay right there. But there's an excitement that there is really no toxicity to this. We have people that are taking many times that. And in the cell studies, as I mentioned, you can grow renal tubule cells in 100% concentration. So it's a very safe compound. But it is worthwhile to say, so, you can start at that teaspoon, and then you can go up and down as your body kind of says, yeah, I would be curious to see what a week of a higher usage would be. And so do, 15 milliliters or a tablespoon a few times a day, see where that takes you. Again, it's just a matter of how much communication you're lacking. Now, all of that said about safety and everything else is exactly true, but you mentioned something important, which is sensitivity. The more annihilated the environment is, you can imagine the more sensitive it is going to be. And the reason is it's not so much that it's sensitive, it's just that there's going to need to be some massive adjustments. So if you've gone from a 30,000 species of bacteria and 5 million species of fungi down to just a few species because you were diagnosed with chronic Lyme or a million other things, and so you got hammered with antibiotics, or you just have a lot of underlying neurologic issues, or a million ways you could become a quote-unquote sensitive person. And most of you already know it. You say, I'm sensitive to everything. I eat, I'm sensitive. Somebody gives me a supplement, I'm sensitive. A drug, I'm sensitive. If you're one of those, then you're just going to start super, super slow. And the profound thing is the more sensitive it is, then obviously the cheaper it gets, because we're now down to the point where for our sensitive populations, 3 tiny little drops under the tongue once a day can shift you. And so start with 3 drops or 5 drops once a day. Do that for 3, 5 days or a week, and then double it to 6 drops. Do that for a week, and then double it to 12 drops. Do that for a week, then double that to 24 drops, and pretty soon you're at a teaspoon a day. Then you can go ahead and double to 2 teaspoons a day, 1 in the morning, 1 at night, and etc. So even if you're a super sensitive person, it's not unusual for 6, 8, 10 weeks to go by, and you're right back up to the normal usage that you would expect. There's a 4-page usage guideline that can take you through all this, a PDF that you can access through the websites.
And I shouldn't take a spoonful of 50 million year old dirt and just put that in.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So it turns out that dirt is about the texture of a hard coal. So you can take a spoonful of it, but you'll be chewing for a very long time.
Okay. All right, Zach, this has been an enlightening discussion. We have started out by looking at what health isn't and the lines of defense in the body, the gut bacteria as their defense, the physical boundaries of the walls that save the gut, the immune system right behind that, the mitochondria, and how glyphosate and Roundup can mess up the folding mechanisms of the proteins, as well as break the tight junctions, as well as mess up the mitochondria. We list just some of the diseases and disorders that were reported as getting better when people switched to a non-GMO diet. So I'm just going to say this. Step 1, eat organic, because Roundup is not just sprayed on GMOs, it's also sprayed on wheat, barley, rye, rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes, lentils, citrus orchards. It's sprayed throughout the food supply, but not on organic food. So buy organic. If what you've heard today inspires you, you can try Restore at a special offer. You can see the offer on the screen. There's a specific date by which you need to get it in order to make it more affordable for you to get if you want your 20-month dose or whatever you want, or your 2-drop dose. So look for the special offer and add the code which should be HGMOs20, but if it's not that, you'll see. Look for the code, and that will give some percentage of the purchase to the Institute for Responsible Technology, which is one of the sponsors of this of this talk. And again, Zach, I want you to know that I have a very good receptor cells for this information, and I would rather this have gone 3 to 6 hours. But I'm being merciful on the people that may not have that ability to stick around. And I just want you to know I'd like to get you back in and do a part 2 at some point, so we can go. I know that every time I talk to you, there's more, and I know I've had to cut you off a few times. I want to hear more. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Jeffrey Smith. And obviously, we've been talking about cell-cell communication, but what you do is communication on the macro level, and we are all indebted to your efforts. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. Safe eating, everyone.
We know our experts are sharing a lot of vital information with you. Don't worry about capturing it all. You can rewatch or re-listen as often as you want to, or share with your friends and family when you invest in one of our affordable educational packages. When you do, you'll receive the video and audio recordings and the transcripts, plus a list of each expert's recommendations to refer to. In addition, when you choose the Platinum Edition for just $97, you will also receive discounts of up to $350 to $750 on supplements, books, and programs offered by our speakers. Simply click the link below to learn more and to purchase.